This is Dave Haroon from Utilivisor.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. We're going to give everyone a minute to enter the room, and then we'll get started. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started in the interest of time. So first of all, thank you for joining tonight's webinar. My name is Kelly Doherty. I am the president of FirstService Energy, and I will be hosting tonight's webinar. Colleen, if you could go to the next slide. Tonight, I am honored to be joined by Peter from Utilivisor and Javid from Harris Beach. They will both be going over sections of their specialty, all in connection with getting alignment with commercial properties for Local Law 97. So to begin, go to the next slide, just a quick introduction. We are going to continue to have a few webinars on Local Law 97. 2 weeks ago, we had a webinar with the Department of Buildings that went into more of the mechanics of Local Law 97. We do have a recording on that. So if you're interested in all the specific details surrounding Local Law 97, as well as the most recent rule changes, feel free to reach out to your property manager and we can provide that recording for you. On April 12th, we will be holding a webinar on financing solutions and incentives and how to plan out these capital projects that have to get done. And on April 26th, we'll be having our final in the mini series on getting the work done. We'll be talking about heat pumps, low carbon technologies, and project planning. Next slide. As a quick introduction, who is FirstService Energy? If you've never heard that name before, but FirstService Energy is an in-house subsidiary of FirstService Residential. We work with our property management division to assist with all energy type projects and regulations. And Local Law 97 for our New York City buildings is one that we spend a lot of time on assisting. our buildings. In addition to regulatory compliance, we also have a data group, a commodity energy purchasing group, energy advisors that work individually with our buildings. We work through incentives and offer education and training programs like tonight's webinar. Next slide. So just a quick introduction. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there are multiple local laws associated with New York City's carbon reduction plan. This has been going on for over 10 years at this point. You're probably familiar with 84 and 87 and the letter grades. Obviously, over the past couple of years, you've seen the A, B, C, Ds, and Fs posted on buildings, and that's all part of the city's goals to decarbonize. And the one that we will be focusing on today is the Climate Mobilization Act, and specifically under the Climate Mobilization Act, Local Law 97, which sets greenhouse gas emission limits for buildings that are 25,000 square feet and above. Next slide. Benchmarking, I do want to just call out a couple of things, because as we are talking through the next bit of slides, benchmarking has a lot to do with how we are estimating a building's carbon potential and potential fine. So one of those elements that your buildings are going through right now is collecting data from the utility. But there are other factors, such as the type of commercial space that was in the building in calendar year 2022, the gross square feet of each of those spaces is very important. So if there were changes to your building, please make sure that those have been communicated with your property manager and First Service Energy so those updates can be made. Next slide. So part of one of the rule changes that came out through the most recent update was that the DOB aligned occupancy types for Local Law 97 with Energy Star portfolio managers' property types. This was a big change to the law. And what this means is that any commercial space in a building has now a better way to classify the type of occupancy. So I will show an example in a few moments, but it's important to note, and why I have this on this slide, that the occupancy type needs to be the most accurate, the definition of it, or the selection of it, needs to be what most accurately describes that space. And as we go into Local Law 97, and your registered design professional will be submitting your greenhouse gas emissions report on an annual basis, they will also have to sign off on each of those designations. There are over 60 property type options, so definitely much better than it was before, with occupancy types only the way that they were previously in the law. This is much better for buildings. Next slide. Just as an example, each property type has an emission limit. So I have a couple examples here. But there is, again, 60 different types that you likely fall into. Each one of those has an emissions factor for the 2024 through 2029 period. And then next slide, Colleen. And that changes for the 20 to 2034 period and every 5 years moving forward through 2050. So a lot of the discussion tonight is going to be about how we're going to address each of these different occupancy types that have different limits, but together you must report your aggregate energy usage and be below your total allotted carbon per building. So I'll walk you through an example of what exactly that means. Next slide. If you haven't seen it already, the majority of buildings under First Service Energy, First Service Residential, First Service Energy has already calculated your fines based on the most recent rule changes. So feel free to reach out to your property manager if you haven't seen it to see where you stand today. It's definitely the first step you should be taking to see where you are. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through a quick example. So this is a building that has multiple commercial spaces. So they have a multifamily section that is 374,915 square feet. Their their carbon limit per square foot for the 2025 period is 0.00675 tons of carbon per square foot. Which means that you take the square feet, you multiply it by the limit, and their allotted or their cap or budget of emissions is 2,530.68 metric tons of CO2 that they're allowed to emit. In 2030, that amount that they're allowed to emit reduces. So then in 2030, their emissions cap for the multifamily section is 1,254.71 metric tons of CO2. Now, adding in the commercial space, so this building has a health club of 133,820 square feet. Their limit for that space is 0.00987. Their cap is 1,320, and in 2030, it goes to 528. They also have a movie theater, a retail store, and a post office. As you can see, all of them have different limits, but together as an aggregate building in the 2025 period, as a collective, they're allowed to emit up to 6,104.36 metric tons of CO2. And in 2030, that goes down to 2,717.96 metric tons of CO2. So that's how the budget is calculated. Now we go to what they're actually emitting. So the actual emissions used based on 2021 calendar year data. So for electricity, the building emitted in aggregate form 34,794,524 kBTUs of electricity. And now the coefficient as defined in the law is this number here. So we take that and we multiply it per square foot and say that their actual emissions that they emitted was 2,947 metric tons of CO2. In 2030, the coefficient is changes for electricity, and thereby the amount that they actually emitting of carbon during that period is 1,473. Now we add these numbers up, so their actual emissions, and it looks like it was cut off a little bit on this slide, but it will be on the next slide. We add those two of electricity or natural gas, and if you have district steam or oil, that would also be included in here. This building only uses electricity and natural gas, but we add all of that up to see what their actual emissions are. Next slide. So based on this, their emissions budget, as I previously said, was 6,104. Their actual emissions was 5,293. So they are actually below their emissions budget. So they wouldn't have any fine in the 2024 to 2029 period. However, in 2030, when their budget is lowered to 2,718, they are above their emissions that they are allowed to meet. They're at 388.20. So the difference between the two times $268 per square foot, their potential annual fine is $295,314 on an annual basis if they were not to do anything to reduce their carbon emissions. Now in 2035, that emissions budget will be lowered even further, so that 295,000 will go up from there. Next slide. So at this point, for buildings with multiple occupancies, we have some questions and some solutions that need to be addressed. The first is, which most of these we will address tonight through some conversation, is that if data is reported currently in an anonymized aggregate form, how is a board to know how much each property type is using? So what that means is, if a retail store is using X amount of carbon, but you're not metering the the boiler heat that's going to that space, the domestic hot water load or the condenser water, or even electric or natural gas or any shared utilities, how do you actually know how much that space is using? Now, if a board doesn't have control or own a lease, how do you get alignment on Local Law 97 emission targets? We're going to discuss that a little bit. What language should be included in future leases so that Local Law 97 is addressed? And the last point, which I'm going to go over in a moment, is if a board is unsure if the square feet for the property type is accurate or not, what should be done at this point? What steps can you take? So I'm going to walk you through that one first. Next slide. And I'm going to go through just the definition of what gross square feet according to the DOB is for 84 and also for 97. So the property gross floor area is the total property square footage of the interior space of that building. It should include the lobbies, tenant areas, common areas, meeting rooms, all of that that's listed on there. But what cannot be included and often confuses some buildings is that exterior space, balconies, patios, loading docks, driveways, et cetera, cannot be included in that calculation. Now, I will say that the Department of Finance and the Department of Buildings does have a gross square foot number for every single building in New York City. However, that may not be accurate. And if you feel that the gross square feet is off, then we do recommend that you work with a registered design professional to evaluate that. And the main reason being is that these calculations of gross square feet affect your Local Law 97 fines. They also affect your energy efficiency grade, but they will have monetary issues if the gross square feet is not accurate. The fine will not be accurate as well, and you may be paying more than you need to. Next slide. Rand Engineering is one of the companies that we've been working with at this point. They do offer a solution to this. They will go to the building. They will document all of the spaces. They will accurately measure the spaces and provide a letter that you can provide to the DOB to make that change with them. As always, we recommend before you make any changes to the DOB or the Department of Finance that you speak with your attorneys. But this is a proactive step that boards may want to take if they feel that gross square feet on record with the DOF or DOB is off. Next slide. So to talk about some of the solutions for data, I'm going to hand it over to Peter, who's going to talk about submetering.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for your time tonight. Killian, we can go to the next slide. Tonight's discussion is that I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Utilivisor as a firm, then how we approach Local Law 97 from a submetering standpoint, the benefits of implementing these revenue grade metering systems, the steps to how you go about implementing them. And then on day two, how do you present that information to your various stakeholders from a master condo level down to the commercial owner and then down to his retail tenants? And then we have a couple of case studies that we'd like to share with you from the work that we've done with First Service. So Utilivisor is a national energy advisory firm. We are a privately owned company. We're headquartered here in Manhattan, and we have offices throughout the United States. Our two core services are energy plant monitoring, where we go into big hospitals, universities, and we monitor their energy plants for efficiency and performance. The second half of our business is our submetering business. We read and bill over 80,000 meters a month for cost allocation. And this is multi-utilities which you will learn in a lot of your buildings, you have multi-utilities that are going to play a role into the effect of Local Law 97 from the calculations. Next slide. Just a quick view, Utilivisor, our company is put together from, being a privately owned company. Our operations and development team is based out of Milwaukee. We have a full service department that goes out and tests these meters on site, which plays an integral role in how you commission these systems. We have a very unique group based in New York that is from an operations center. And we monitor these meters and these central plants in real time, which is going to play a key role in how you work with the various stakeholders within your buildings, because you're going to need to have this behavioral change and this dialogue in order to help bring down these energy usage, in turn reducing the fines within the building. As I mentioned before, we have a full billing team that puts out sub-metered invoices for your tenants. And then we also have a team out there reading meters manually on a monthly basis. Next slide, please. So how does Utilivisor approach Local Law 97? The first way that we look at it is from an energy metering standpoint. You have to understand how much energy is being used in each one of these spaces. Most of the first service buildings that I've gone and taken a look at is that it's put together of electricity reading and billing. A lot of your sites provide condenser water to your commercial tenants. I'm sure that the example that Kelly gave about the multi-use facility that had the theater, I'm sure they're using condenser water, chilled water, hot water. So there's there's multiple utilities that will go into these calculations. One of the most important things is, what do you do with that data? You got to have someone looking at that data on a daily basis to make sure that it's correct. The last thing that you want to do is be reporting information that the data is not validated. And that's a process that we have in-house that we focus on. And we want you, to make sure that if you implement these metering systems, that you have the correct team validating that information. You should also go out and understand the plants that you have in your buildings. I know there's various size buildings that you have, but some of your buildings have boiler plants. You should understand how to operate those boiler plants and work with the operators and the maintenance people in your buildings to help retrain them to make sure that the information and the way that they're operating the plant is reducing your overall energy usage. Next slide, please. So what is the benefit of having a revenue grade metering system in place? Buildings have this metering system in place. They'll be able to identify the tenants that are really driving and impacting the lower building scores and fine. It helps you define who are the different users in the building that you should sit down with it to come up with a plan of how they reduce their energy. You should also understand your real-time operating costs. As I mentioned before, you're using condenser water, heating hot water, chilled water, and this will additionally help the building to identify its common area costs a lot better. We think that having accurate meters and accurate energy information, you can drive down your common area costs. As I mentioned before, this data can be used to work with the commercial tenants to help them improve things such as they may have their own building automation system that's separate from your residential side. We've seen this before. As an example, if you're looking at a theater, a large theater, is that I'm 100% sure is that they'll have their own control strategies that they're using. But at the end of the day, the way that they're operating their systems are going to have an effect on your overall, scores through Local Law 97. So you want someone as an owner's representative working with both sides to help them reduce that energy. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what are the steps that should be taken to order and to implement these systems? First thing you want to do is you want to go out, you want to hire a firm that has expertise in sub-metering and has an operations center, as I mentioned before, staffed with licensed and degreed engineers. When they come out to the site, the first thing that they should go ahead and do is they should provide you with an engineering scope of work, a consulting services to review the metering system in place. They should actually take all the tenant leases first and the master condo documents and review the way utilities are currently being allocated. Sometimes, as an example, on condenser water, you may be charging the commercial tenants on a connected tonnage load. You may say, I'm charging you $300 for every ton of condenser water that's connected. Other leases may say that it should be on a metered value. So those are items that we look at. And then we go back and we understand the generation cost of those utilities. In order to produce condenser water, you got to meter the pumps in the building. You got to meter that big tower on top of the building with the fans on top of it. In order to come up with a generation cost, then that can be applied to these meters. You want to have someone go out and create a meter system drawing that can then be taken out to the street to go out and work with meter vendors and contractors to provide you pricing on these jobs. And I must warn you, not all contractors know how to implement metering. It's a very specialized and process-oriented business that, cutting into steam lines and putting specific types of meters is that I warn you on, the select group out there, and you really have to focus on getting those contractors. The most important thing at the end of the day is putting in the data collection system. That data collection system should be non-proprietary. In many of your buildings and your apartments, you're currently sub-metered today on the electricity side. A lot of those meters are by meter manufacturers, and they try to pull you into their metering systems and their platforms, which locks you in for 20 years. Utilivisor and most of the people, including myself, we all come from an industrial background where we believe in non-proprietary systems so other people can take over those systems and service them. Killian, you can go to the next slide, please. Here's a quick example of a job that we worked on with FirstService, multi-utilities. Understanding condenser water, electric, heating, hot water. So what we provide our FirstService clients with is we give them a drawing after we trace out all these piping systems. And our team, having come from a shipping life of tracing out ships, these systems on large ships, is that we go out in the field and we're crawling all over these pipes and identifying really where the meters should go, because not all meters can go, in the easiest location. There's different thresholds of where these devices to go to ensuring their accuracy. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so the types of meters that should be implemented. First thing that you need to do is you need to confirm that they're revenue grade. Don't let, as I mentioned before, don't let the meter manufacturers sell your condo board on using their proprietary software. That's a big no-no. Make sure that the firm that is designing and implementing the system integrates the meters into non-proprietary data collection system. Confirm how the meter data will be validated to ensure accuracy. I can't tell you how many times that we take over jobs and I ask, what was the commissioning process of those meters? Did they go out in the field? Did they put meters, portable meters, in line with the new meters that were put in to make sure that they were programmed accurately? Did someone come out and read them for multiple months to ensure that the meter data locally matches the meter data going through the cloud? These are all steps that we as a company, Utilivisor, have embedded in our processes. And whether you work with us or you work with another firm, is that you want to make sure that they're following similar steps. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a metering platform that we have that was implemented at a FirstService building where, again, they were breaking up multi-utilities. So we're looking at real-time data. And when I say real-time, is that some of the data is coming in 5-minute intervals. we're looking at it from usage profile standpoints. You want to make sure that you work with a firm that can really baseline your different systems against each other. Is that when we set up these, these platforms and we're gathering this data after we commission the meters in the field, is that we will go ahead and say, you have a restaurant, it should operate, on this kBTU per square foot. And we make sure and we validate them against 20 to 50 other similar types of different entities that are the same. So you set up these performance thresholds, and then we go out and we work with the maintenance team and the engineers that are at the building, and say, this one seems kind of out of line, because you'll see that on my next slide is that this data is being used for the fines. Another thing that we recommended in the future is that this is an example of what our invoice looks like, is that we recommend that you actually not only, have your electricity if the tenant only uses electricity, but in the future, we'll be tracking their CO2 emissions directly on their invoice. So there's no question. I feel that in the future is that a lot of people within the stakeholders are going to question your numbers. And questions the fines that will be given. So you have to have backup information. You got to have auditable processes in place to ensure that there's no finger pointing. And those processes that I spoke about in the previous slides, and then showing on the bill that your utilities are audited through the tariffs, that you have all that documentation to show your different stakeholders. Next slide, please. So here's a quick example. This is our operations center, again, in Manhattan, is that our team here is that we're utilizing the real-time data to collect and analyze to make the recommendations to help with the operational costs. Is that monthly basis is that, easily monitor progress, check reports, make sure everything is running as efficiently as it possibly could be. You want to make sure that your sub-metering systems have 99 to 100% uptime, because again, you're going to be communicating through the internet. We all know things drop offline, but when they do, make sure that you've selected a firm that has a team in place that is automatically working with your building to fix those issues. And if you can't get them fixed right away, that they have a team of in-house manual meter readers to go out and read those meters. The last thing that you want to do, and us as a revenue grade billing company, is put out estimates, especially as it pertains to the laws and the future requirements that you have. Next slide, please. Just an example I like to give is it's an excellent job that we work with First Service, 85 J Street, multi-stakeholder property, multi-utilities, all of this information communicating in real time, and down the road is that, again, it's a newer building, but in the future is that the type of tenants that they bring in and how they use the energy will affect their scores in the building, but we are tracking that type of information. Next slide. 140 West Street, one of the most complicated multi-stakeholder buildings, beautiful apartments, and then you have Verizon in the building. And again, very stringent processes that Verizon had that were imposed back on the condo owners. And again, the steps that I spoke about before, where you go in, you engineer and design the system, and then you track it, on an ongoing basis, and making sure that a lot of your buildings, I've noticed, is that I'll walk into, is that you have meters in place. And I always ask, teams out there, I said, when was the last time these were commissioned? And a lot of times they weren't. So making sure that it's put into your operating procedures, that at certain times we can recommend when these meters should be tested. Next slide, please. 225 Fifth Avenue is that I got the nicest compliment today from the board president there, is that we were able to, in a very short frame of time this year, implement a metering system and ensure that he was recouping the most amount of revenue from his commercial tenants. He's also already, he knows that he's going to be using this system for their local law 97, energy tracking. So this is a great example of people that have, because of, generating and billing out revenue, they have the system in place now to be used for their energy tracking. Next slide. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Peter. I think this is a very important item. Talking about submetering, we have many buildings that have no clarity on how much each of the commercial spaces are using and how that relates to the amount that they're allowed to emit. The next topic that is also comes up quite often is, okay, what do we do? Now, from a legal perspective as a board, what options do we have to ensure that each of the commercial spaces are not going above their emission limits? And if they do, what can we do? So I'm going to hand it over to Javed that's going to walk us through that.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank everybody for joining us here today. Next slide, please. Kelly did cover a lot of this, so I won't harp on it too much. But first of all, we should understand that building owners will have certain obligations under Local Law 97. These are going to include the emissions limits that Kelly went over, annual reporting, and then to comply, we'll have energy efficiency improvements. There's alternative ways to comply. And at the end of the day, if we have non-compliance, we have penalties. So that, in a nutshell, those are the obligations. Next slide. First step in coming to compliance is cooperation with your tenants. And by tenants, I mean here anyone that holds a lease in the building. Could be commercial, could be some other use. It could be actually just your other residential clients, your unit members. But really, it's just that communication with the tenant is going to be very important. And the earlier that a building owner can start giving people the heads up that this is coming down the way and then things will need to change, the better. Start thinking about the types of efficiency improvements that you're going to perhaps take. If for right now you're going to be in excess of your GHG limitations, or you anticipate you will be once the regulations become more stringent. And obviously you want to give some thought as to what you're going to want to do with incentives and penalties for helping folks come into compliance. Next slide, please. Submetering is an important consideration, but let's just remember that under Local Law 97 as it's currently written, it doesn't allow the city to issue separate LL97 fines to submeter tenants. When they have standalone energy systems. However, submetering is still very, very important because in terms of allocating costs or looking for contributions and having people do their fair share of what needs to be done to be in compliance, submetering is really one of the only ways to have a quantifiable metric as to what everyone's contribution is in terms of emissions, and as well as what their contribution should be in terms of compliance. Another important is, let's look at our leases and lease clause and governance documents to see what they have in there. Just make sure that these documents that govern the relationships between building owners, tenants, and subtenants, and whatnot do have the tools in there necessary to be able to kind of make sure everyone is in compliance. Next page. For example, some of our lease terms and clauses, we should make sure that there's requirements that a tenant has to comply with energy efficiency laws, regulations, building codes, Local Law 97, and specifically if your building is one that's likely to exceed GHG limitations, you can have internal rules that apply, which would be as applicable as any other house rule or building rule or condo rule. The lease terms would also require, compliance with LEED standards, especially where a commercial space is generally vacant, and then a new tenant comes in and starts building out, that build out, if it's done within the league guidelines, could actually result in minimization and reductions in GHG. Similarly, if requiring the use of Energy Star rated or other energy efficient appliances as a lease provision or an obligation under that lease is another means to be able to achieve your limitations or your conservation efforts. Other requirements here, we have use of renewable energies or purchase of renewable energy credits. And again, where that sub-metering comes into play is then you can obviously allocate costs of who pays for what of the renewable energy credits depending on their usage. Of course, we have building system upgrades. If we have lease provisions that we can build in with our tenants, which would require cooperation for these types of upgrades, I can define who, which tenant, which party would be responsible for what portions, and all of those important considerations. Next one. I mentioned briefly that you can also achieve compliance through purchasing of renewable credits or carbon offsets. There's guidance that's out there already, but also being developed. Again, lease terms and governance documents amendments are crucial in here because it really just sets forth the obligations between the parties. And if we kind of contemplate, who pays for what, that would make that relationship go a little bit easier. Lease clauses, which mostly none have right now, they should include individual reporting by tenants. This kind of puts their limitations, their emissions kind of forefront on their mind, and this will help the overall building with its reporting requirements. Talked about submetering a little bit already, and then incentives and penalties. We should definitely have lease provisions that specify financial incentives, kind of the carrot in the situation, or penalties, and how fines would be allocated, which would be the stick. And these are in most commercial leases and also residential leases, you're not going to really see many of these options or many of these terms right now. But as we get closer and closer to this effective compliance for Local Law 97, we're going to start building these into new leases and start talking about how do we amend existing leases with long-term tenants to incorporate these obligations therein. Next slide, please. Couple of issues we can talk about if we have some time, but I'm not going to harp on them too much. Really, the issue is when you have multiple uses in an occupancy building and you've got non-compliance but one occupancy type, how do we allocate costs? How do we figure out those relationships? There could be a situation where your compliance cost actually exceeds your enforcement fines, and what do we do there? Questions arising as to how do we amend leases. The easiest is if we have new leases, we're going into relationships with new tenants. It's easy to incorporate into a lease that hasn't been signed. But what do we do in terms of leases that are already out there and that aren't going to be expiring for a while? And then, your typical relationship between the building owner or the condo board versus a lessee who owns a commercial space but doesn't necessarily occupy or operate out of it, versus then the subtenant relationships and how folks kind of manage all that. So those are issues that should be on your radar, issues that building attorneys should be able to assist you with if you've got questions. But in hopes of saving a little bit of time for questions, I think I will end there.
Okay, thank you so much. Before we go to a quick round for questions, if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A so we can get to those in a moment. Just a reminder, in the spirit of engagement with our residential tenants or residential owners or shareholders, it's very important, or residents if it's a rental building, it's very important that we try to help them through incentivizing them. Grid Rewards is a program with Logical Buildings that actually pays anyone that has a direct meter with Con Edison to reduce energy consumption during periods during the summer. It's free to participate, and they only have to download an app and then reduce consumption in their apartments when an event is called, and then they get paid out biological buildings. Also on the building side, there's a demand response program for the building meters that buildings can participate in. It's free to participate, and once again, the building would get paid for reducing any load that they do during those events. And next slide, Colleen. And just a reminder again, we have 2 additional webinars coming up, one with getting work financed, and then of course getting the work done on April 26th. So we did have a couple of pre-questions, and Colleen, maybe you can take down the slides, and Peter and Javid, if you could bring your cameras up for a moment. One of the questions that came up was about long-term leases, and what if you could provide some guidance on what a board can do when they don't own the lease and a third party does, and it's a long-term lease in place and they have not been getting cooperation from the owner or the leasee.
So the typical lawyer, answer always starts with, well, it depends on the situation, but that's actually true here, because what we would need to look at is, obviously you have the lease and the lease language. The lease itself might offer mechanisms for modification for circumstances due to changes in the law or regulation or something like that. But presuming that there's nothing in your lease there, then we need to look at what your relationship is with this tenant. Are there other documents out there that govern that relationship? And typically with a condo, the answer to that is yes, right? You've got your governance documents, you have your declaration, you've got your bylaws, perhaps an amendment that might require a supermajority of the ownership. An amendment to a declaration or the bylaws can impose an obligation on a commercial unit owner who's not willing to cooperate with a lease amendment to become in compliance. So that's really the big way to kind of approach this. But again, that requires the governance documents to be amended such a way that, sometimes you have situations where you have to either have 100% compliance, or a impacts to a commercial unit can only be done by like a commercial unit governance board. So it depends on the circumstance, but generally speaking, a modification or an amendment to your governance documents should be able to address a non-compliant and non-cooperating tenant.
Great, thank you. Another question I'm going to throw at Peter. How do you measure gas usage when the building only has 1 gas meter?
Gas is a very tough meter to install, but we have many jobs out there. It all depends on what the gas is actually feeding. A lot of times is that you have boiler systems that are getting gas directly into those boilers. Hopefully there's a dedicated account for that. If not, is that we can have a team come in, install like a separate gas submeter, but then the line has to be pressurized and tested to ensure the safety, since we have cut into the pipe there.
Okay. And charge for some of their utility usage, and the building doesn't own the space, such as a private investor owns the space and therefore a condo association doesn't have a contractual relationship with that tenant, how could we start charging them for their usage? I don't know if Peter, I mean, that kind of sounds like a combination between the two of you answering what has been done in the past. Peter, maybe if you could shed some light on that.
Okay, to go in is that, again, all of these utilities, they can be broken down by different entity types. So it's a matter of getting down how far down that granular level that you would like to go. Is that then we can go in and do different allocations in order to distribute the costs associated with those. So from a metering standpoint, it can be achieved.
And I think specifically this question was about if you weren't charging for those utilities specifically in the past, and now you are metering it, how can you charge for them now if it's not listed in that lease? And I would say two things. One, you don't necessarily have to charge for the usage that you are now collecting on that space for the purpose of knowing how much greenhouse gas emissions they're emitting per space. It's just data at that point. Now, if you wanted to charge, then yeah, you would have to work with your attorney on and Javed, if you want to kind of come in here. But that, you're right, if a lease is already in play and then you want to change the terms of the lease, then you need to speak with your attorney about that.
I'd like to say one thing else is that we went to a job recently is that we noticed that the condenser water charge was extremely low because it dated back to a lease that was signed over 15 years ago. So after performing the metering is that it's interesting to sit down and see really what is that generation cost. You're selling it, let's say at $200 a ton hour. In today's rate, it's actually costing you $400 a ton hour in order to provide that. So from a financial impact, it's a good evaluation tool for you to sit down and then make a business decision off of.
Okay. I'm not seeing a lot more questions come in, but I will say that there was one about specific occupancy type and if it was vacant or not, or unsold. It doesn't really matter if it's occupied or not occupied, or leased or not leased. The type of occupancy that it is at that time, and there is a vacant option for retail or anything like that, that would go into the calculation for a portfolio manager. But if it's a residential section and apartments are not occupied or sold or anything like that, that still is part of the calculation for the residential section of square feet. But if there's no energy associated with that, it's actually kind of helping the building with their total aggregate energy usage. Okay,
Yeah, Kelly,
so
let me just take a different spin on that as well. So you're 100% right on that analysis. Sometimes in terms of being able to impose additional obligations on holders of unsold shares in a, say, for a co-op, the rules are a little bit different. You can't necessarily change governance documents in such a way that it impacts the rights of a holder of an unsold share. And so it becomes a little tricky. And again, unfortunately, what I say is you have to look at these governance documents and see how these owners of unsold shares are treated, because they are, you're right, treated differently under the governance documents, but there still could be a way to be able to modify them so that they can certainly pay their fair share of any compliance or upgrades or anything like that.
Great, thank you for that. So I would leave everyone with that, this is a complicated puzzle that every building in New York City is going to have to figure out. I highly recommend first looking at where you stand today and making sure your occupancy types are defined properly based on the most recent years, the previous year's usage, and then going from there. But things like submetering are going to give you more information to help you understand where each occupancy is at, having lease language in place. But in the end of the day, we are going to need cooperation from everyone in the building, from the residential section to each of the commercial sections. Everyone's going to have to do their share to reach these emission limits. I want to thank everyone for joining tonight. We will have the next two mini webinars coming. These are designed to be quick webinars to get to the topic and answer a few questions. If there's any questions that come up after, feel free to reach out to your property manager and they can direct us, direct them to myself and my team. Once again, thank you so much, Peter and Javed, for joining today. I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, and thank you very much.